ESG, environmental concerns.
Today, we're plunging into, a world that's changing incredibly fast, the global economy.
It really is.
Companies right now, they're navigating this landscape where, everything from climate change to major geopolitical shifts, it's all impacting their ability to stay competitive. It's a complex tapestry, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And the thing is, these challenges are so interconnected, businesses can't just focus on one area anymore.
Right. Not in isolation.
No, they're having to strategically adapt, manage these significant environmental risks, and navigate these increasingly fragmented global supply chains. It's a whole reevaluation, really.
And that's exactly what this deep dive is all about. Our mission for you listening is to unpack what's truly happening behind those headlines.
Cutting through the jargon.
Yeah. Cutting through the jargon, giving you the key insights into how corporations are tackling these twin pressures, sustainability, geopolitical shifts, and crucially, what it all means for everyone.
We'll look at the tools, the strategies.
It's some surprising complexities, too. Okay, let's jump right in.
Let's do it.
So let's start by unpacking this new reality for global supply chains. For decades, it was all about just in time, right? Lean, efficient.
Hyper efficient, yeah. Minimal inventory, keep costs down.
But the last few years have really shaken that model up.
Definitely. Shaking it to its core.
We're seeing this clear pivot towards just in case. Resilience, security, they're becoming much more important, maybe even more than pure efficiency.
It raises a big question, though. Are we actually witnessing a true great rewiring of global supply chains?
Or are these predictions of deglobalization, maybe a bit overblown?
Well, what's fascinating is how quickly the language has shifted. All these new buzzwords popping up.
Like friendshoring.
It's exactly friendshoring. That term, U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen really brought it to the forefront.
And what does it mean fundamentally?
Fundamentally, it's about streamlining supply chains, focusing foreign direct investment, but doing it through countries you see as geopolitical and economic allies.
Building a network of trusted partners, essentially.
Precisely. A good example is the U.S.-led Mineral Security Partnership, the MSP.
Right. That's, 13 countries and the EU?
Yep. And their specific goal is securing critical raw materials, partly to counteract China's dominance there, strategic alliances for essential stuff.
Okay. And then you have the EU using a slightly different term.
Yeah, they talk about de-risking. It's maybe a bit less confrontational.
How so?
While it aims for similar outcomes, mitigating risks, especially with China, but it avoids explicitly targeting anyone. It's framed more around managing.
And the nuance continues when you look at the actual trade data, doesn't it?
It does. Preliminary data suggests, direct U.S.-China trade has dropped off a bit.
But trade with places like India, Canada, Vietnam is up.
Right. But that increase might just be trade diversion, goods getting rerouted.
So the stuff could still be originating in China, just taking a detour?
Potentially, yeah. It means those preferred countries might be relying heavily on Chinese exports themselves to fulfill the new demand. It complicates the picture.
So what is driving all this reconfiguration?
Our sources point to 4 big forces working together. Geopolitics, obviously.
Disruptive tech.
Disruptive technologies, absolutely. Then the growing impacts of climate change.
And other crises, like COVID.
Exactly. These aren't separate issues. They're all intertwining, fundamentally reshaping global production and supply chains.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly to climate change because the urgency there is just immense.
It really can't be overstated.
We need to remember governments agreed in Paris to limit warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius, aiming for 1.5.
But where are we actually heading?
Well, current trajectories point towards maybe 2.2 to 4.4 degrees by the end of the century.
Which is dangerous territory. Beyond 1.5 degrees, you're looking at severe drought, sea level rise, ecosystem collapse.
Catastrophic impacts.
Yeah.
And that's why the corporate response is so critical, so urgent.
And that's exactly where science-based targets, SBTs, come in.
Right. Explain those briefly.
Okay, SBTs are basically greenhouse gas emission reduction targets that companies set. But the key is they're aligned with the science, the pathways needed to actually limit warming to 1.5 or well below 2 degrees compared to pre-industrial levels.
So it brings scientific rigor into corporate climate goals. And why are businesses actually adopting them?
Precisely.
It's not just PR, right?
No, not at all. Our sources show real advantages. SBTs can boost competitiveness in the low-carbon transition.
Drive innovation.
Definitely drive innovation, enhance credibility, reputation. It shows leadership. It's actually proving to be good for business.
Got any numbers on that?
Yeah, some compelling ones. The Low Carbon Technology Partnerships Initiative, for instance. It could potentially deliver 65% of the needed emission cuts by 2030 and channel maybe $5 to $10 trillion in investment, support millions of jobs.
That's huge.
And here's a surprising one. The top 100 U.S. electric power generators. Between 2008 and 2013, they cut CO2 equivalent emissions by 12% while increasing generation.
That really challenges the old idea that growth has to mean more emissions.
Exactly. It shows it's possible, even at scale.
And the investment community is noticing this, right? With initiatives like GICCC, SASB, TCFD.
Yes, the financial world is definitely signaling a shift. They see the risks and the opportunities.
Okay, so to understand how companies tackle this, we need to quickly talk emission scopes.
Right. Scope 1, direct emissions from their own operations, burning fuel in their factories, for example.
Scope 2, indirect, from purchased energy, electricity, heat.
And then the big one, Scope 3, all the other indirect emissions up and down the value chain.
That's the tough one, right?
All right.
Supplier emissions, customer use of products, everything else.
It's often the largest chunk and the hardest to track. Just for perspective, electricity and heat production was about 25% of total human-caused greenhouse gas emissions back in 2010. Industry was 21%.
And the power sector alone.
Around a third of global GHG emissions. So those Scope 2 and upstream Scope 3 emissions are absolutely massive.
So given how tough Scope 3 is, what are the main hurdles?
Data availability is a huge one, especially across complex global supply chains and just the sheer number of different emission sources.
Okay, so how do companies set these SBTs in practice? What kinds of targets are there?
Well, our sources mention a few types. You've got absolute targets, just an overall cut in emissions. Simple enough.
Then intensity targets.
Right, emission intensity targets. That means reducing emissions per unit of something, per unit of product, maybe, like for steel.
Which is pretty homogeneous.
Exactly. Or per unit of value added, which works better for diverse sectors, like retail, perhaps.
And then the crucial Scope 3 target. And these can be absolute or intensity too.
They can, or they can be supplier engagement targets. That's where a company basically pushes its suppliers to set their own SBTs for their Scope 1 and 2 emissions.
Covering a big chunk of the main company's Scope 3.
Ideally, yeah. Covering at least 2/3 is the guideline.
That sounds like a massive coordination effort. Getting internal buy-in across a big company must be tough.
It really requires careful strategic planning. You need to explain the science clearly.
Build relationships across departments.
Absolutely. Use those interpersonal skills. And crucially, frame the targets in business terms, risk, opportunity, revenue.
Get teams involved early.
Essential, don't spring it on them.
Okay, moving beyond just carbon. Biodiversity and ecosystem risks are also coming into sharp focus now.
Yes, definitely. There's much more scrutiny from governments, regulators, driven by frameworks like the TNFD, that's the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures.
And the EU's CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Standard.
Right. So companies need robust biodiversity risk assessments now, identifying risks like habitat destruction, water scarcity, pollution.
And analyzing the impact on their business, their supply chain, their bottom line.
Exactly. Using advanced tools to forecast those long-term impacts, both ecological and financial.
I can imagine the challenges, though. Data gaps, especially across different regions.
Huge challenge.
Okay, let's pivot to geopolitics in action. How does this play out in specific sectors? Energy first.
Well, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that sent massive shockwaves through global energy markets.
Unprecedented gas shortages.
Totally. By mid-July 2022, pipeline gas prices were up, over 800% compared to before the escalation?
Astonishing. And the ripple effects were global.
Huge impact.
Yeah.
Industry, households, everyone felt it.
And the big takeaway.
It just hammered home the urgent need to accelerate the shift to low-carbon tech. Fossil fuels are still 80% of the global energy mix.
So initiatives like the EU's green hydrogen strategy become even more critical.
Absolutely. Aiming for 40 gigawatts of renewable electrolyzers, 10 million tons of renewable hydrogen by 2030.
But there's a catch with hydrogen, isn't there? The colors.
Ah, yes. Green hydrogen is the goal made with renewables, zero emissions.
But there's gray hydrogen.
Made from gas, emits CO2, and blue hydrogen.
Also gas-based, but with carbon capture.
Right. And recently there's been more talk, maybe a push, towards blue hydrogen.
Why is that potentially problematic?
Well, while it seems like a quicker fix than scaling up green hydrogen, it risks locking us into fossil fuel infrastructure for longer. And it could reinforce dependencies on existing gas-rich countries rather than promoting truly decentralized renewable energy.
Interesting nuance there. Okay. Food and agriculture. The war's impact there has been devastating, particularly on a human level.
Absolutely devastating. Price hikes for food, fuel, fertilizer. The projections are grim.
Like 27 million more people pushed into poverty.
27.2 million into poverty, 22.3 million into hunger just because of rising world prices. Stark numbers.
It really drives home the human cost behind these big geopolitical moves. It's not just trade figures.
No, it's basic human well-being, and some countries are incredibly vulnerable.
Like Myanmar and Rwanda.
Their agri-food production could fall over 4%. And countries like Egypt, Tunisia, Ethiopia, heavily reliant on wheat imports.
They face severe reductions, maybe over 10%.
Yes, it's a direct humanitarian crisis fueled by geopolitics.
And then raw materials. China's role here is dominant.
A quasi-monopoly in many areas. Over half the world's mineral processing capacity. Around 86% of rare earth elements in 2022.
And the EU depends almost entirely on China for rare earth magnets.
Almost entirely. So, understandably, countries are scrambling to diversify.
Now, what are the main strategies?
3 main approaches. 1, boost domestic or regional mining and processing. 2, form international partnerships like that mineral security partnership we mentioned.
And 3?
Boost circularity. More recycling.
And industrial policy is a big part of this push. Things like the EU's Critical Raw Materials Act.
And the Net Zero Industry Act, yeah. Plus the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA.
Yeah.
all aiming to build up domestic capacity for these critical materials.
But China isn't just sitting back, right? They've used their position strategically.
Oh, absolutely. Imposing export bans on key stuff. Gallium, germanium for semiconductors.
Graphite for EV batteries.
Yep. And something like 90% of the world's graphite is refined in China. That gives them immense leverage. It really shows how trade can be, well, weaponized.
Which brings up ethical concerns.
Right.
Friendshoring could leave some developing countries out in the cold.
That's a real risk. And rushing to scale up mining could compromise ESG standards, right? Environmental protection, social impact.
Indigenous peoples' rights, especially.
Critical concerns. It's a very tricky balance to strike.
Okay, final sector focus. High-tech and electronics, H&E.
A foundational sector, absolutely crucial for everything: healthcare, defense, communication.
And again, China plays a huge role here.
Dominant in producing many upstream components, integrated circuits, batteries, plus consumer electronics, smartphones, EVs.
So countries want more control, more autonomy.
Increasingly, yes. Investing heavily in domestic production, semiconductors, batteries, and using trade measures to secure their own H&E value chains.
Reshoring, moving production back home or to like-minded countries. That's likely to mean higher costs for consumers, right?
Almost certainly. And new inefficiencies, too. You get fragmented supply bases, higher labor costs, stricter regulations in advanced economies.
It marks a real shift, doesn't it? Security of supply potentially trumping pure cost efficiency.
Definitely. That's a major change from the mindset that dominated globalization for decades.
Which brings us back to that industrial policy debate. Is government intervention a good thing here?
Well, there are strong arguments on both sides. Some say, yes, purposeful state action is essential for structural transformation, especially for developing countries trying to move up the ladder.
They point to places like Korea with its chaebols.
Right, those giant conglomerates that drove growth. Or a more recent example, Indonesia banning nickel ore exports.
And what happened there?
Their nickel-related exports exploded from around $6 billion in 2013 to nearly $30 billion in 2022. It suggests targeted policies can work dramatically.
But the critics have valid points, too.
They do. They argue industrial policy is risky, distorts prices, wastes resources, opens the door to corruption.
And that developing countries are better off focusing on fundamentals. Education, trade costs, stable economies, attracting FDI.
Exactly. FDI brings knowledge, jobs. It's seen as a less risky path by many.
So what makes industrial policy succeed or fail?
A lot depends on how it's done. Our sources really stress implementation capacity. Having skilled, high-quality bureaucrats like South Korea had for its export programs seems critical.
Without that strong institutional foundation, the risks might just be too high.
That seems to be the consensus.
Okay, so redrawing supply chains means higher costs, industrial policy debates, but also new pressures within the chain. Let's talk about this supplier squeeze.
Right, and these are becoming just minimum requirements to even be a supplier. But here's the kicker.
They often don't get paid more for it, especially in sectors like textiles you mentioned. And this isn't just textiles. Mining, too, right? You mentioned community development agreements, CDAs.
Yes, they're being used more to try and share the benefits of mining projects more equitably, address long-term community needs.
But challenges remain, like unequal bargaining power. Okay, let's zoom in on one industry as a case study. Textiles and apparel, T&A. It's seen huge volatility.
Unprecedented volatility since the pandemic, really.
What are the main drivers?
Our sources highlight three big ones. One, digitalization and the explosion of online sales.
2, growing demands for environmental sustainability,
And 3, geopolitics, that whole de-risking from China trend.
which has led to this China plus one strategy.
Widely adopted, yeah. U.S. buyers, for example, want to diversify away from China but not leave entirely. The data is interesting.
61% plan to replace China as their main source.
And 80% plan to reduce sourcing overall in the next couple of years.
But China is still crucial.
Absolutely. Still a huge end market and critically a massive supplier of raw materials, yarns, fabrics. Over 70% of U.S. buyers said they have no short-term alternatives for many Chinese materials.
And then you've got the ultra-fast fashion players shaking things up. Shein, Temu.
Yeah, huge disruptors using that test and react model. They need speed, so they rely on some nearshoring.
But most production is still in Asia.
Still largely Asia, yeah. It's a hybrid approach, balancing speed and cost.
And geopolitics complicates things further for brands.
Massively. Remember, the Chinese government calls for boycotts of H&M, Adidas, Nike, overstatements about Xinjiang.
So what's the overall trend? Where's the T&A industry heading?
Well, that need for speed, linked to online sales, plus geopolitics and sustainability. It's pushing investment towards nearshoring.
Central America, Mexico, Turkey.
Places like that, yeah. And also towards regional verticality, integrating textile production closer to where the clothes are actually assembled, a real dynamic realignment.
Okay, final topic. Sanctions. A major geopolitical tool now.
Increasingly significant, yeah. And they trigger big shifts, trade patterns, investment flows, alliances.
But they come at a cost, right? Welfare costs.
Significant costs, not just for the sanctioned economy, like Russia losing maybe 1.84% of welfare from embargoes.
With big price hikes in affected sectors.
Right, but also for the countries imposing the sanctions. Multilateral sanctions have bigger impacts, but even smaller nearby sanctioning countries can take a surprisingly big hit.
And the effects hit individual firms hard.
Significant indirect effects, yeah. Disruptions spread through the economy.
What about consumers and investors? How do they react?
Financial markets react clearly. Firms with big exposure to sanctioned countries often see their stock prices fall.
So public sentiment, ESG factors, they're really influencing corporate decisions in these geopolitical moments.
Absolutely. It shows how interconnected everything is becoming.
So that leads us to a final provocative thought for you, our listener, to consider.
As these global supply chains keep changing, what's the right balance we should be aiming for between efficiency, resilience, and genuine social and environmental sustainability?
And maybe even more critically, how can the interests of producer countries, especially in the global south, be more fairly integrated? How do we ensure this race for critical resources and security doesn't end up overshadowing the need for a fairer, more sustainable world for everyone?